Now we're going to get into the seedless vascular plant diversity. So these are plants that don't make seeds, but they still have vascular tissue, unlike the bryophytes, which don't make seeds and don't have vascular tissue. So here's the phylogeny again. We've talked about the bryophytes, the liverwort, hornworts, and mosses. Now we're getting into the lycophytes and the Monilophytes. So we're going to talk about club mosses, spike mosses, and quillworts, and then also horsetails, ferns, and whisk ferns. So beginning with the lycophytes, I'll go ahead and show all the text here. So lycophytes kind of have changed in the ecological role over the age of, or their existence on Earth. They used to be really, really dominant during the Carboniferous period, and they've become less dominant over time. There's a variety of different reasons for that, but in the Carboniferous period, they used to be really tall. Some of them were up to 100 feet tall. Now most of ours are like this big. So they're very, very small now compared to what they used to be. Now they do still prefer really humid environments, ones that get really moist, not like a liverwort does, where it's like extremely moist, not quite aquatic, but pretty much close you can get to that. But they still need to be really humid. That's one of the main reasons why they're not as big or as dominant as they used to be. The Earth has dried a lot since the Carboniferous period. But that does mean ecologically they're in areas that are still quite wet. The north-facing slope here in the northern hemisphere, or areas where there's a little rivulet, or where there's a lot of humidity gets higher there. They are starting to have little leaves now. They have what we call microphyll leaves, so it's not like a leaf like you'd see on like a sycamore or a grape or something, but they have one leaf with one tiny central vein in it. So we call them microphyll leaves. They're very reduced compared to what you typically think of as a leaf. Now they do produce sporophylls. So you can see those here in this picture. Little sporophylls here that form into a strobili, which, well, that's actually what's in the picture. And the sporophylls are inside of there. And they have like a little cone basically to produce the spores for the sporophyte. And they are sporophyte dominant. So when you're looking at them, you're pretty much always in these ones looking at the sporophyte. The gametophyte is often very tiny, very reduced, oftentimes just below ground, and depends on mycorrhizal relationships to survive. And so you're not really finding the gametophyte for these plants. You're pretty much only looking at the sporophyte. Here are three different examples of these. Oh, that's supposed to say spike moss. Let me fix that real fast. So spike moss here. So spike moss is really common. We see it all over here, our Fresno area. Club moss is not quite so common, and quillworts you almost never see. So beginning with the resurrection plant, this is a spike moss. Now when we say spike moss, it's not a true moss. It's just the common name of it. It is not a bryophyte. Mosses are bryophytes. Spike moss is just a bad common name. This one is famous for being called the resurrection plant. Whoop, what happened there? As you can see here, it's really dry. And when it gets wet, it will come back to life. Sometimes these are called like the Rose of Jericho. It's a common name in horticulture, but we just call it resurrection plant because it resurrects in the presence of water. Locally, we have this is the one here, Selaginella lepidophylla, but we have Selaginella hanseni locally, and it's all over the rocks or in our foothills habitats, and it's really dry during the summer, and during the winter or when it starts to rain in the winter and spring, it gets really green and lush, and then it'll go back to being dry again, and it can go back and forth and survive like that. When it does dry out, it tends to curl up, and then when it gets wet, it tends to open back up itself. Okay, so for lycophytes, there's not a whole lot to talk about. You can see that they do have veins, so you can see the stems here, and they can get pretty tall. I have some club mosses that are about this tall, which means they do have to transport water, so they have that vascular tissue there. But other than that, we're not going to focus on them too much. Okay, so we're going to move on to the Monilophytes. Now, the Monilophytes are plants that are really important to a lot of different ecosystems. And they're very closely related to the seed plants, much more than the lycophytes are. And they have megaphyll leaves, meaning big leaves, not those microphyll leaves that the lycophytes have. These leaves can get huge. If you think of like a big, gigantic fern, that's a big megaphyll leaf. They were also very, very dominant during the Carboniferous period. and have kind of shrunk a little bit. But I would say their role is probably still a lot larger than the Lycophytes is. So this is going to include stuff like ferns, like the maidenhair fern here, the whisk ferns, and horsetails, the Equisetum. So we're going to kind of, Lycophytes, we're just calling them Lycophytes, and you know the common names of them. For the Monilophytes, you need to know the classes that they are in as well. So when you're talking about ferns, we're talking about the Polypodiopsidae. Ferns fall in the class Polypodiopsidae. These are the true ferns. They are very widespread, the most widespread of seedless plants, probably by far. Any habitat you go in, you're pretty much finding ferns there. The other ones you're only finding in very specific habitats. If you go here locally, you'll find them in grasslands, foothill woodlands. You'll move up into the pine forest, they're there as well. Ferns are very, very widespread. Now, ferns are kind of odd. If you look at the big leaves, if they're kind of reproducing at the time, if you look on the back of it, on the back of the megaphyll leaf, you'll see these little sori, these little brown spots. Those are spore-producing structures. So they're going to produce spores and then release those spores into the waterways. Those spores will then grow into a gametophyte, like you see here. And from that gametophyte, they'll reproduce, and then the sporophyte will grow out of that. Now, megaphyll leaves, when you look at the leaf here, you can see how it's basically like, if we were to use typical leaf terminology, it's pinnately compound once and then twice, so maybe a bipinnate leaf there. And that requires a lot of vascular tissue to get water and nutrients around. But there's a lot of diversity in Polypodiopsidae, vascular tissue and leaf structure, and they're quite variable. They do sometimes produce, or never mind, I talked about that already. So here's the life cycle of let me fix that, it's kind of off screen there. Here's the life cycle of a fern. We have the diploid version on the top and the haploid part of a life cycle on the bottom. Remember, these are sporophyte dominant, just like the lycophytes are. The bryophytes are gametophyte dominant. So when you're looking at a fern, you're looking at a sporophyte. So here's the fern as you know it. On the back of it will be the sporangia that grow the spores. They'll go through meiosis, release the spores. They're going to germinate and create a gametophyte, a little gametophyte structure like that. They will release the sperm and the egg. The sperm will come from the antheridium and try and swim over and eventually find an egg. When it finds the egg, it'll fertilize it. It'll create a zygote. That zygote will then grow out of that archegonium, into the sporophyte. And so you're not really seeing many fern gametophytes. If you're lucky, you might find one, but you're almost always seeing the fern sporophyte. Oops. So I can get that video to work. Okay, I'll post that video. I won't play it here. Ferns are also very important ecologically and economically for a variety of reasons. So when fronds are both first opening, they have these little coiled structure called fiddleheads. They're the immature fern leaves, and a lot of cultures tend to eat them. We don't eat them really in the U.S., but they can be really important to different cultures for diet. They also form a big part of coal deposits. So we're extracting coal. Not all of it is fern deposits, but some of them are dominated by ferns. Now, locally, we also have this azolla here. This is called water fern. And if you've ever driven by a waterway and seen it's like covered by some sort of red plant, like just a mat of red plants, you're looking at water fern, Azolla folliculoides. And what's cool about water fern is that it actually has a symbiont, a cyanobacteria, I believe it's called Nostoc azole, that extracts nitrogen for the plant and gives it to it as well. Just like legumes have a rhizobium symbiont, a bacterial symbiont, water fern has a cyanobacteria symbiont, but for better resource acquisition, especially nitrogen in the water. Ferns also can contribute to rock weathering and soil formation. So they can often inhabit environments like alongside rocks, underneath rocks, and they do a good job of helping to break rock formations down over long periods of time and allowing the soil to develop. Okay, now we're going to move on to class Equistetopsidae. These are the horsetails. You've probably seen these around. Oops. They really like to be inside of waterways, or they basically like to have their feet wet. They don't like to be completely underwater, but they like their below ground structures to basically be completely saturated at all times. And if you try to grow them in your yard, they typically don't do very well unless it's a very wet environment. What's cool about these is the stems. So here's the stems. They have silica in them. Silica is basically glass. Now it's not like sheets of glass, but the same molecular component that's in glass, which makes it really rough and really scouring. Sometimes you'll hear something called scouring rush. They're typically referring to horsetails, which means you can also use them to clean really well because they're pretty good at scrubbing since they have those silicates inside of their tissues. The stems are also photosynthetic, so you can see this the photosynthetic, the greenness there tells you that they can photosynthesize. Now, what's also weird is that some of them have these branches on the side. Those are stems. So they're lateral stems that are being produced that they're using for photosynthesis. So they've basically completely switched to using stems for photosynthesis rather than leaves. When you're looking at a horsetail, these little structures here, these dark structures, those are the leaves. And so the horsetail is not really relying on leaves for photosynthesis at all. It's relying almost entirely on stems. They're also usually hollow, allowing for good gas exchange inside of their tissues. Some of them, they have different structures or shoots that shoot up. Some of those will be reproductive ones that will have a strobili, that you can see here, that will produce sporangiophores to make the spores. We can see that a little bit better here. So here's a vegetative shoot. Here's a reproductive shoot. Now, you have non-photosynthetic leaves, you have the branches of whorls there, green photosynthetic stems, and if they put up a reproductive shoot, it'll have these strobili on top of it with sporangiophores that are going to produce the spores. Those spores will get released, they're going to grow into gametophytes. The gametophytes can be bisexual or unisexual. These ones happen to be, at least in the images that we can see, unisexual. Here's the antheridium, here's the archegonium. The sperm will have to swim from the antheridium or get moved by water to the archegonium. It'll be fertilized, and then it'll grow shoots up out of it, being the sporophyte. So very similar to the other life cycles we've seen. But again, almost entirely sporophyte dominant. The gametophyte stage, not going to be really visible. Then we have class Silotopsidae. These are the whisk ferns. This is probably at least locally, the least important of the Monilophytes because we don't really see them very much. They don't have true roots or true leaves. So they're using photosynthetic stems here again. Now they do have sporangia, but if you notice it's split into three parts. So there's three sporangia that are produced that fuse into what we call a synangia, kind of the main characteristic of this group. And you can see how the branches kind of bifurcate, which kind of gives it the name of the whisk fern. Now, in order to get nutrients, their root-like structures that they have are actually create mycorrhizal relationships with fungi, and the fungi are primarily the ones that are giving them the nutrients. They're also the only vascular plant that doesn't actually have true roots like that. And it's likely that they resemble possibly one of the main ancestors of vascular plants, but it's kind of mixed. It's unclear how derived they are and how not. But the ancestor of vascular plants probably looked more like these than they did other vascular plants. Okay, just to recap, we've talked about the club mosses, spike mosses, and quillworts from the Lycophytes. Again, not focusing too much on those, we're kind of lumping those all together. And then we talked about the Monilophytes, which are the horsetails, Equisitopsidae, the ferns, Polypodiopsidae, and the whisk ferns, Silotopsidae. And all of these, again, are sporophyte dominant, while the bryophytes that we've talked about before are gametophyte dominant.